Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today the topic is Sun Tzu and Jesus, the way of war of Jesus. So it's a bit unusual, but a revealing question that I'm going to ask. What would Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military genius strategist, think of Jesus Christ, his approach to war? The Catholic Church's long history with political power, modern attitudes of the American Christian evangelical church when it comes to warfare, and also statecraft, political statecraft. I know it's a strange mix, but that's the point. Sun Tzu wasn't religious, but he was deeply ethical in his thinking about war. Sun Tzu taught that the best general is the one who wins without fighting, who preserves order with minimal harm. So what happens when we place that ancient military mind of Sun Tzu next to the Prince of Peace of Jesus Christ, and then look at how the message of Jesus has been applied or misapplied over the centuries? So Jesus Christ, Prince of Peace. Let's start with Jesus. Historically speaking, Jesus of Nazareth never led an army. He never raised a sword, and he never endorsed violence. Jesus' most famous military statement might be this: put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And his teachings were consistent. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, blessed are the peacemakers. His kingdom, he said, was not of this world. If Sun Tzu were listening to this, he might say, here is a man who has transcended war entirely, one who understands that true power doesn't lie in swords, but in persuasion. True power lies in sacrifice. True power lies in transformation. Sun Tzu valued victory without battle. Jesus offered redemption without conquest. In that sense, Sun Tzu would admire Jesus not as a general, but as a figure who neutralized violence without using it. So strategically speaking, Jesus' approach undermines violent resistance by disarming it. That's something even Sun Tzu would probably call wise. So if you look at the early church and you see how that kind of took root, how that developed. So let's talk about the early Christian church, or the early Christians, those who followed in Jesus, especially in the first few centuries. For the first 300 years, Christians refused to fight. The followers of Christ refused to fight. They were persecuted, they were mocked, they were even executed, but they wouldn't bear arms. They wouldn't fight back. They remembered the example of Jesus, his teachings. To Sun Tzu, this would look like a deeply disciplined movement. No rebellion, no insurrection, just patience, just moral resilience. So that kind of discipline earns respect. But then something changes. So when you look at what came after 300 years, in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, and Emperor Constantine suddenly makes that faith that once shunned the sword was now partnered with an empire, the Empire of Constantine. So by the time of the Crusades, many centuries later, Christian armies were now marching to war under banners bearing the cross of Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Sun Tzu would likely be baffled. He might ask, if your founder preached nonviolence, how did his followers become holy warriors? The Crusades were framed as moral wars. They were framed as liberating holy lands, as defending the faith. But the Crusades were also brutal, nearly always political, and nearly always driven by human ambition. Sun Tzu taught that war should only be waged to restore harmony, not to glorify power, not to glorify ideology. Sun Tzu would probably see many medieval wars as strategically clumsy around the Crusades, expensive, drawn out, and morally destabilizing. But he'd also understand the logic of control. Aligning religion with political power is effective, but it's not always wise. The Church's use of war may have kept it dominant for centuries, but at the cost of the message of Jesus, the original message of Jesus. Sun Tzu might say, you won battles, but lost the moral foundation, and that in the long run, that weakens any empire. So you look at what's happening now and the modern American evangelicals and militarism. Let's fast forward to today. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the modern, modern West, particularly the United States, where many evangelical Christians support the military, support gun rights, and support a kind of a religious nationalism. Some believe that American power is a God-given force for good. Sun Tzu would be cautious. First, Sun Tzu would question any ideology that ties military might to divine favor. Sun Tzu knew that arrogance blinds leaders to reality. Sun Tzu warned that overconfidence, long campaigns on moral confusion will lead to collapse. So when religion is used to justify preemptive war, torture, or endless conflict, Sun Tzu would see that as dangerous. And this goes with all religions, all faiths. Strategically, war destabilizes the home front. War, morally, it will undermine the faith that you follow. And more than that, Sun Tzu would see it as a complete departure, for example, the teachings of Jesus, where Christians are concerned. He may say, your founder, Jesus, taught humility, he taught patience, he taught sacrifice. But some of his loudest followers now speak with the voice of empire, of conquest. That's not strategy. That's dissonance. Now let's compare that. Let's compare what we've discussed with each other. Let's compare Sun Tzu, Jesus, church. Jesus, Sun Tzu would respect Jesus as someone who truly mastered the art of restraint. The early church, he would say, was disciplined. He said it was cohesive and, yes, even peaceful. Sun Tzu would admire that moral clarity. The medieval church, yes, it was powerful, but it was compromised. It compromised Jesus' teaching. Sun Tzu would likely criticize the fusion of spiritual ideals with state violence. And when you look at modern militarized Christianity, Sun Tzu would probably say, "You've forgotten the heart of the teachings of Jesus, and you replaced it with rhetoric and force." In every case, Sun Tzu isn't judging based on theology. He's judging based on strategy. He's judging based on discipline. He's judging based on long-term effectiveness. Now, let's reflect on what we've talked about. So what's the takeaway here? Sun Tzu reminds us that power without principle is self-defeating. Power without principle is self-defeating. And Jesus reminds us that sometimes the most radical act of leadership is non-violence. So when you marry two ideas, you get something rare. You get a strategic ethic, a moral clarity that understands both the need for peace and the discipline it takes to maintain peace. And maybe the most important lesson is this: don't confuse divine strength with military strength. Do not confuse divine strength with military strength. Sun Tzu did not need to believe in Jesus to see the brilliance in his method. Because when you win hearts, you don't need armies. Or, to borrow a line from a book by my friend Joel Hayward, here is a commander who conquers not by force, but by principle, who sees war not as a hunger, but a burden, whose victory lies not only in the battlefield, but in the hearts of men. And perhaps that's where Jesus and Sun Tzu quietly meet. So thank you. Thanks so much for listening. If this gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section. You can also follow me on social media. What would you like me to discuss next time? Sun Tzu and Gandhi, Sun Tzu and the Dalai Lama, Sun Tzu and Malcolm X. Let's keep the conversation going around Sun Tzu. And if you're curious, I highly recommend reading The Art of War, alongside the sayings of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount. I know it's a strange pairing, but it might change how you see leadership, how you see power, how you see faith. Until next time, peace be upon you, and remember to subscribe to my channel, and see you soon.